Hi, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Randhir. I'm an architecture photographer based in New Delhi. Delhi is a city that I was born in, but I've spent most of my life living outside of, and only returned to 6 years ago after 20 years in New York working as an architect. So my practice today focuses very much on the role that photography plays in architecture and in understanding architecture, as well as in understanding modernism and histories of modernism in India in general, and in Delhi specifically. I'm going to read a quick quote from a book called Camera Constructs. Switch to this. All right. Photography did not simply document built works. It was employed in the process of surveying, conceptualizing, passing judgment on, and planning the city, in state propaganda, advertising, and architectural manifestos, in architecture and planning education, and as a creative tool within the design process. So, studying as architects, our education is heavily dependent on the photograph. Of the thousands of buildings you study in school, you get to visit a fraction of them. Mostly you understand them through photography. And I did not really realize this when I was a student, nor as a practitioner of architecture. I've only come to understand this a little bit better as a photographer. And I've found that in this context of photography and its important role in understanding architecture, the photographer becomes, quite important. As photography to me is entirely subjective, and a photographer makes a number of subjective decisions about framing of architecture and how you photograph it and what you photograph. So the photographer becomes very, very important in understanding architecture and understanding architectural history. So I'm going to show a number of different projects. I'm going to try and read my notes as I'm going through this. I'm not wearing my glasses, and I can't read my handwriting sometimes, so you'll have to forgive me if I kind of go off track. One of the first projects I worked on when I came back to Delhi was called CPWD, and it's an ongoing process. It's been alluded to earlier today. CPWD is a Central Public Works Division, Central Public Works Department. It is the main government, central government agency that built housing for, well, not just housing, but everything that the government needed for its functioning was built by the CPWD. Through history, the CPWD today is an offshoot of the Public Works Department that worked under the British rule in India. And it provided, and what I've focused on primarily is housing that the CPWD was making. And this project kind of relates back to my thesis in college, which was an urban development project set in Delhi. And I was sort of studying a lot of this housing at the time. And so I found that our history, in teaching history of architecture in India, the history kind of glosses over the work that the CPWD did. And when you look at Delhi, and I would argue most of India, people's first kind of interaction with modern architecture, arguably, is housing projects such as this. These ones are actually from pre-partition, probably around the 1940s. Both of them are located in Lutyens, Delhi. If you're familiar with Delhi, this is Pandara Road. Some of you might recognize it. It's actually a really beautiful, leafy green kind of colony. And these are sort of pre-partition housing projects, 2 stories. They were thought of, each flat would either have a garden or would have rooftop access. So you always had access to the outdoors, also because Delhi would have extremely long power cuts in the summer, and you could sleep outside, otherwise it was just too hot. This is also pre-partition. This is Walter George in the 1940s. This is Lodi Colony. So our modernist history of architecture kind of glosses over all of this work, which always struck me as quite strange. Like when you understand modernism and history in Europe, social housing projects are really integral to understanding that. But yet, we somehow gloss over this entirely. Our architectural history books don't cover this at all. There's one chapter in one history book that I found so far that talks about this work. And I would say maybe like 40 or 50% of Delhi's urban fabric is projects built by the CPWD. So this is something that I started working on, and it's kind of ongoing. And I'm hoping to kind of expand this project into other cities and explore different kinds of architecture. The government, the CPWD authorities would sort of practice and prototype projects in Delhi, and then they would be exported around the country, in different ways. So again, these are all a couple of shots of Lodi Colony. That little hut in front, DMS, stands for Delhi Milk Scheme. That was the main government method of providing protein to a largely vegetarian population. This is the market in Lodi Colony. I think I'm missing over a bunch of things, but anyway, I'll just keep going. And now there's a really great boutique in there called Raw Mango, but anyway, some of you might recognize that too. And these are all sort of British-era sort of housing projects. This is the train station. This is Sarojini Nagar. This is post-partition, probably built in the 50s and the 60s. Delhi influenced, as has been talked about earlier as well, a huge influx of migrants at the time of independence. And there was a need to find housing for them, and there was also a need to provide housing for government employees, because the bureaucracy, of India just kind of exploded. And salaries are quite low, so one way the government would make it feasible for government employees is to provide them with housing. And as the housing came in different kinds of types. Earlier housing projects would have a mixture of types, so people from different economic strata would be kind of mixed together in the same neighborhood. And there was this kind of really nice sort of ideal of sort of classless, casteless society that could possibly exist and possibly created. And I feel that was maybe the intention behind it. Of course, that was completely subverted very quickly. And later housing colonies were grouped by type. So all the type 4s would be together, and the type 5s were together, and the type 1s, which are the smallest, would be kind of, elsewhere. So in part of doing this project, I got to thinking about modernism and how, like I mentioned, how that history has been talked about and written about. When I studied modern Indian architecture in college, it was almost described as something that arrived in India with like Le Corbusier and Kahn. And it always felt odd. Like it just didn't seem like that's what was happening. Modernism elsewhere was a part of a social change and a part of a change in methods of production and changes in the economy and changes in society. So why would it be any different over here? And as I've studied these kind of housing projects in particular, I've found that these modernist projects stretch all the way back into the 1930s, into the 1920s. And I think they present like a nice idea of continuous stream of modernism kind of taking place through the society, through Indian architecture. And Delhi walas really love their plants, as you can see. So this is a little bit later. This is these are referred to as the Habib Rahman type houses. There was a type 1 and a type 2, which were dependent on size. And if you look at it, I mean, to me, the influence of the Bauhaus is very clear. There's large glass curtain walls, which oddly face south. And the poor residents of these flats have, literally glued cardboard on the inside of those windows to be able to survive the summers. This is again Habib Rahman. It's a high-rise block in R.K. Puram. This is Gulabi Bagh on the left and Sarojini Nagar. These are later constructions. So today, the government is rapidly tearing down these housing colonies, and massive areas of Delhi are in this state of kind of decay, where the flats are in the process of being demolished. Some of those demolitions have been halted by court order, mostly by environmentalists that are trying to protect the trees. Nobody seems to really care about the architecture, but there's a lot of concern about the trees, and I kind of agree with that. So I've donated a number of these photographs to court cases that are being fought so that people can locate trees in different neighborhoods. So this is Narojini Nagar, which I was able to sneak into during demolition. So you can see they've recycled the doors out of all the flats. Those will be sold and used elsewhere. This guy was taking a bath somewhere over there and just happened to walk across my frame. Now this whole colony has been completely wiped out. It's a huge pit that they've dug, and the construction has been halted because there was a lawsuit, because this is a residential colony and they're trying to make some sort of World Trade Center or something, which is commercial. And so it's all stopped. And it's just contributing to the Delhi's awesome pollution. So this project kind of led me to this Water Towers project, which is another kind of interest I have in looking at kind of these elements in the urban landscape and the urban fabric that are quite often overlooked, mostly by residents of the city. Nobody really goes to Sarojini Nagar for anything other than the market, which we used to all go to when we were in school because you could buy like cheap jeans. But nobody went to roam around in those neighborhoods, and they're actually really beautiful. And Water Towers, which I'm showing at Ishara right now, these again were, to me, they felt like they were part of this, the machine of like modern living. They, just through design of how a water tower works, you pump the water up when you have electricity, and then you're able to provide pressurized water to all your flats, which are like 4-story flats or 2-story flats in the neighborhood. Without the water tower, you don't have water, upstairs. It's quite simple. But to me, they also seemed like a modern version of the village well, where everyone, accesses the same well for water, regardless of what your position in society is. That was also subverted, because more important people would have a pipe at the top of the water tower, and the less important people would have a pipe at the bottom of the water tower, where you get the worst water. When I came back to Delhi, this project also ended up becoming a really fun way, an interesting way to kind of map the city and to explore different neighborhoods that I would never really conceive of visiting. During my thesis in '99, I had this IIT city map of Delhi, and in it, and I was using it for research, and in it I noticed that the map located water towers on it, which I thought was odd. I understand hospitals and monuments and temples, etc., but like, why locate water towers? But all these years later, I came back and I was actually referencing the same map, cross-referencing against Google Maps and going to these neighborhoods to try and find these things and to photograph them. And part of the project was very much about this object in the landscape. And Delhi, as you can tell from these photographs, is very low slung. It's like 4 stories is like a tower in Delhi. It's like high rise. So mostly things are quite low, and these water towers would usually end up being framed against the sky because they're so much bigger than everything around it. This project was, kind of an alternate mapping exercise at the city in terms of being able to go and visit these different kinds of neighborhoods. It was partly sort of a portraiture project, because I was trying to frame these things, as you can see, kind of center of the frame, right in the middle. Anyway, there's a larger selection of Ishara. Go and see it. And in this question of looking up and trying to understand alternate histories or different histories, architectural histories in India, we came across this project, which is in Golconda. It's the ashram, the Sri Aurobindo Ashram, which was designed in the 1920s. I think so. She's nodding, so it must be right. By George Nakashima, Antonin Raymond, and a number of other people along with the mother. And it's arguably one of the first concrete buildings built in India. Far predates anything else that was done. There were a few, I found out recently, there were a few government housing projects in Calcutta that were built in cast-in-place concrete, although the documentation of them is really spotty. But this thing is just this kind of like mirage that sort of appeared out of nowhere in this little former French colony. Absolutely beautiful place. You would come here, it's a dormitory. You would come here if you were studying at the ashram. And it's really this very quiet place of contemplation. The furniture is all designed by Nakashima. The entire thing was built by the residents and members of the ashram, so it was completely unskilled labor. that worked in building it. I found out quite recently that at the time in India, concrete was not available, so they had to import that. Steel was not available, so they had to import that, and like rebar. So they would bring boats, and the ships couldn't get close enough to the dock for them to unload it. So they would take fishing boats out there, unload each piece of rebar one by one, and like bring it to shore, and then figure out how to kind of build this thing and kind of pour concrete and make this whole project. Connected to this, and this again, in this idea of exploring histories of architecture that have been sort of forgotten, this is a very recent project. It's the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. The IITs are a system of technical institutes that was set up very much as a part of this idea of nation building. The idea was that IIT graduates, who actually get a really fantastic education, would then be instrumental in guiding India and creating this new nation. Unfortunately, they all went to America and started working for tech companies and have made their millions over there, and nobody's come back. But anyway, this was designed by J.K. Chaudhary in the 1960s. I'm showing this work alongside Madan Mahata in a two-person show in Delhi that's opening next week. Madan's work is also at Ishara. You should definitely check that out. So J.K. Chaudhary worked for Le Corbusier in Chandigarh on that project, and as you can see, it's quite influenced by Corbusier's form making and shape making. In photographing this project and in thinking about the role that I play as a photographer, I'm very careful about how I frame things and what I include in the frame, what I leave out, and those decisions become important in how you understand the photograph and understand the architecture and understand the environment that the architecture is sort of existing in. On the left is the men's dome. On the right is the women's dome, which is literally like a cage, which is kind of weird, but anyway, it's like this screened off cage. This is the main auditorium in the university. So my father actually went to IIT in the 60s, and he was there before any of the landscaping kind of grew in. I don't know, I'm going to go back for a second. As you can see in some of these photographs, it's actually quite a lush green landscape. And Madan Mahata's photographs show this absolutely barren environment because the landscaping simply hasn't grown in. And that's something that's quite something that I always knew about Delhi and didn't focus on, is the fact that the city is actually very, very lush and very, very green. So taking a little detour, just to talk about other projects in Delhi that have been quite interesting. This is Akbar Bhavan, designed by Shivnath Prasad. He also worked for Corbusier, but then decided to take a break and wanted to make a project that was completely different from anything Corbusier was doing, and then he made this, which is very much like Corbusier. So it was designed as a hotel. It was the Akbar Hotel. It sits on a hill in the diplomatic area in Delhi, and it's by far the tallest building. And the top floors of this are a ministry, an Indian government ministry, which I think are basically spies, because they can overlook like literally all the embassies from here. The foreground, the big hole that you see there, was the Chanakya cinema, which I think was also Shivnath Prasad. Has now been replaced by another cinema and a very high-end shopping mall. I'll move through quickly. This is Kanvinde. This is the Delhi Dairy Board. He worked for the government his whole life, creating incredibly complex sculptural forms. This is Kuldeep Singh, NDMC building in Delhi. A lot of these projects were photographed at the time they were built and then have been basically ignored, for 50, 60 years. This is Joseph Stein, Triveni Kala Sangam. Also Stein, this is American Embassy School. So Delhi, because of its being a capital, has a number of beautiful modernist embassies as well, which have been also totally ignored. This is Johannes Kran, the German embassy. This is was the Yugoslav embassy and is now shared between Serbia and Montenegro. The architect might be Bogdan Bogdanovic, but we're not sure. All the records were lost when Yugoslavia collapsed. This is the Finnish embassy with Raimi and Reili Pietla, who also did the foreign ministry in Kuwait, I think. And I'm just going to end where I sort of started with the Hall of Nations, which again was this act of kind of erasure and destruction perpetrated by this Hindu nationalist government that we have. It was really sad to see this go. It was even more sad to see how easily it went. I think that as architects, I've been told to stop. We could have put up a much bigger fuss, and as students of architecture, there should have been a really big fuss about the loss of this project. But thank you.